Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Balanzategui. I am the founding editor of Horror and Gothic Media Cultures, the book series with Amsterdam University Press, which hosts this discussion group and also the related podcast, or what we like to call provocation series. You can find the book series online and you can also connect with us via our Twitter account. And we're excited to be launching the podcast and discussion group for 2022. And our provocation for this month, for our first session of the year, is how does the rise of streaming video services affect or influence the horror genre? And both myself and one of the co-editors of the book series, Professor Ndalianis, will be hosting this discussion on Monday, the 28th of February. The other editor of the series is Professor Isabella van Alphen. So the idea with the discussion group is that every month we release a podcast episode in the form of a short YouTube video. You're watching this month's episode right now. And the video or podcast episode aims to provoke ideas and discussion around the topic of horror and Gothic media cultures. So that's why we call it a provocation. It's designed to spark ideas that will lead to discussion in the subsequent discussion group. So our discussion this month will take place on the 28th of February at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, Melbourne time, which is where Angela and I are based. And that is 8 a.m. in Amsterdam or Central European time. And details can be found in the video description. Anyone is welcome. So you're welcome to join the discussion group via Zoom, no matter which country you come from. So obviously that means you need to double and triple check that you have the right time in your own time zone, because it can get a bit confusing. Don't hesitate to get in touch with me if you would like any help with that. I will do my best. So anyone is welcome to join the discussion group who has a kind of research interest in horror and Gothic media cultures. Also, practitioners are very much welcome. So creative practitioners with interests or who work in horror and Gothic media cultures and popular commentators or writers as well. So if you write about horror and Gothic genres in a less academic forum, you're also welcome to attend the discussion group. So the topic of our discussion, and thus the provocation that we're dealing with this month, is how does the rise of streaming video affect or influence the horror genre? And when we say streaming video, we are mainly referring to subscription video on demand services, or SVODs, like Netflix. However, streaming services like YouTube have arguably also had an impact on the horror genre. And you might like to bring to the discussion your perspectives on this. I know that one of the scariest pieces of horror content that I experienced in the first decade of the 2000s was the YouTube series Marble Hornets. This first appeared on YouTube in 2009. Marble Hornets was one of the most well-known and popular pieces of media about the Slender Man character. So the Slender Man, as I'm sure many of you are aware, was a product of participatory internet storytelling cultures, so not just this one web series. And Slender Man has become probably the most well-known and notorious digital native boogeyman of the 21st century. So perhaps in our discussion this week, you might be interested in coming back to questions around how YouTube has contributed to the horror genre in the 21st century. So maybe how horror content on user-generated platforms like YouTube may have influenced the style and aesthetics and narrative form, even themes of horror films and television. The horror anthology TV show Channel Zero is certainly an interesting case to consider in this regard. So each season of Channel Zero adapts a popular creepypasta story. So the creepypasta are these online horror stories like those that manifested the Slender Man that are designed to be shared and expanded across the web. And Channel Zero picks up on this trend. But in this provocation, I'm going to focus mainly on SVODs and their influence on the horror genre, because I think it's a very interesting question which as yet has not received adequate attention in scholarly research on horror. And to appropriately kind of grapple with this question, we have to address the issues like, how has the horror genre factored into the content acquisition strategies of SVODs like Netflix? And as part of this, how has horror been involved in the original content strategies of these platforms? Content like Netflix's hit show Stranger Things, that has been produced especially for, and thus is exclusive to, the platforms themselves. And Stranger Things is, of course, a really influential example because it was one of Netflix's first uber successful originals. And it's a horror sci-fi hybrid, but it's a horror show featuring children and seemingly targeted at family audiences. The show's creators, the Duffer Brothers, have claimed that they pitched the show to between 15 and 20 networks who declined on the idea before they achieved success with Netflix. And the Duffer Brothers suggested that a key reason the idea kept getting declined was the network's discomfort with a horror show that featured child characters, children as the main characters, and also that seemingly targeted child and family audiences. So maybe horror content that targets family audiences is a particular niche that SVOD platforms like Netflix can harness. So a way for SVODs to show off their distinction from traditional modes of broadcast television. So Netflix, like other SVODs, obviously is grounded on an on-demand viewing model. So it has freedom from the set air times of kind of broadcast television. And as part of that, there's a related kind of lack of importance when it comes to ratings like the M for mature audience ratings, which broadcast television networks obviously have to think about a lot, given that they do rely on set air times and also issues around advertising and local policies around ratings and air times and all of those kind of issues. And the pivot to horror-inflected dark family content in the SVOD ecology, a pivot that's been largely kind of influenced by and initiated by Netflix. This kind of pivot is an area that my research with Joy Baker and Diana Sanders has explored and is kind of continuing to explore. And another element to consider regarding the influence of SVODs on horror content is the increasing diversity and fragmentation within the SVOD ecology. So the SVOD landscape is obviously much bigger than Netflix now, and it doesn't kind of orbit around Netflix as this key driving or influential force in the way that it once did either. So we also have to kind of move beyond Netflix in the way that we think about how SVODs have influenced the horror genre. So we have what Andy Lynch and Alexa Scarletta in their research called top tier platforms like Netflix and Amazon Prime Video, and they're doing something specific with the horror genre. But we also have genre-specific platforms now like Shudder entering the scene. And Shudder is, of course, an entirely horror-focused streaming service. So very exciting for us horror and Gothic fans, aficionados, experts. So Shudder has opened up a space for direct-to-streaming or direct-to-screaming, to follow Shudder's oft-used pun. It's opened up a space for this direct-to-streaming kind of horror content that in some ways has replaced the direct-to-DVD or video horror production market. And we have to recognize that Shudder operates in distinctive ways when compared to the top-tier or generalist streaming services like Netflix. Netflix famously offers kind of personalized access to a vast catalog constituted of many different genres, whereas Shudder is obviously entirely organised around horror and targets horror fans specifically. And Andy Lynch and I have started to explore the implications of this targeted approach in our research, and we may talk about this in some more detail in a future provocation. But suffice to say that the fact that horror is Shudder's focus means that the platform functions not around kind of personalization. So it doesn't deploy a recommender algorithm to suggest content to a user depending on their personal taste. Shudder operates more around curation. So as I said, Shudder doesn't really have this kind of recommended for you type content recommendations, but it does have a catalogue of horror content organized into specific subgenres that would appeal most and make the most sense to horror aficionados specifically. And this in turn has implications for the types of content produced or acquired for the platform. So it's interesting to note how Shudder, as part of its curatorial approach, is positioning itself as a kind of valuable archive of horror content. An example of this is the launch of the platform late last year of the George Romero film The Amusement Park, which was kind of heavily marketed by Shudder. So this film was one of George Romero's earliest films. And it was, as is emphasized in the description of the film on Shudder, recently discovered and restored 46 years after its completion, and it provides an alluring snapshot of the filmmaker's early artistic capacity and style. So this kind of illustrates how Shudder, as part of this curatorial approach, is positioning and marketing itself as this kind of culturally valuable archive of horror content. Another example of this is the platform's acquisition of Kier-La Janisse's celebrated documentary film, Woodlands Dark and Days Bewitched, A History of Folk Horror. So this is categorized on Shudder as a Shudder exclusive, but it actually launched at a range of film festivals last year. So this film does what it says on the tin and offers a history of a specific type of horror, folk horror. And folk horror is still taking shape as a genre, and the documentary contributes to how we might be able to understand folk horror generically within the broader terrain of the horror genre. And it's interesting to think about the way Shudder has got involved in this dialectical process of generic definition. It's updated its catalogue organization to kind of celebrate the launch of the film on Shudder. So it now has a folk horror subsection, which it describes thus: wander the haunting landscapes of influential, beguiling genre folk horror. There's a "the" missing there, I think. And there are a really diverse mix of films organized in this folk horror category on Shudder, including the Thai film from 2021, The Medium, the Australian supernatural Ouija board mayhem film, Alison's Birthday from 1981. Also the 1973 American film Messiah of Evil, which was directed by the husband and wife team Willard Huyck and Gloria Katz, who would go on to co-write and direct the notorious Howard the Duck in 1986. So there's quite an eclectic mix of films gathered under this folk horror label on Shudder. Films that we probably would not have considered as belonging to the same subgenre prior to this SVOD platform-driven process of generic categorization. So what we can see on this genre-specific platform is an active attempt to curate titles in a way that promises to enrich and maybe even inform the horror fandom of its subscribers. And in some ways, in doing this, Shudder's even seeking to contribute to current discussions around the shifting definitions of key subgenres like folk horror. And obviously, all of this has implications for the type of horror content that is produced and distributed in the 21st century. And even importantly, the type of films that are remembered and retained in the cultural consciousness. SVOD platforms like Shudder play a really important role in film preservation now that physical media is declining with the rise of SVOD services. So that's another thing to potentially think about and perhaps to talk about in our discussion this month. So I look forward to working through this question of how has streaming influenced the horror genre when we meet via Zoom on Monday the 28th of February, 6 p.m. Melbourne time, but please check that you have it right in your own time zones. I look forward to mulling this over with you then.